All right, so let's get started with topic 4.3 here in period 4. This particular section is all about politics and regional interests. And this is going to be specifically as we move from the early 1800s and the administration of Thomas Jefferson, as we move into the later era of the Jeffersonian Republic, how different regions of the country, whether that be the North, the South, or the West, had different interests that really affected how they viewed the federal government and how they viewed politics in general. So let's get started with that. The period that we're going to be talking about really stretches from around 1808 to the election of 1816, which is going to take us all the way to 1820. And again, you can sort of see the changes in the maps here. When you look at the election of 1808, you have Madison, Pinckney, and Clinton, and you can see how Madison really takes control over most of the electoral college map. And then that changes a little bit in the election of 1812 with a little bit of a loss of support here in the Northeast with New York, New Jersey, and in that Northeastern region in the election of 1812. And then again in the election of 1816, James Monroe really starts to again expand that control back into the Northeast. So, how do those different interests and what was going on at the time that really changed how politics really functioned in this era? So, we're going to look at the learning objective for this section, which is how do different regional interests affect the debates about the role of the federal government in the early republic? And that's what we're going to discuss more in depth today. Now, one of the first things we're going to talk about is the Tariff of 1816. So we're jumping a little bit ahead here because the Tariff of 1816 obviously comes following the War of 1812 that's fought between the United States and Britain. We will talk about the War of 1812 a little bit more in depth when we get to topic 4.4. So the Tariff of 1816 comes into place and it is passed explicitly to protect U.S. manufactured goods from overseas competition and really to help, attempt to help encourage American manufacturing. Now, what a tariff is, it's something we've talked about off and on here, but it's important to remember that a tariff is an added tax that's placed on top of the cost of an imported good from another country. Whether you import, today we import cars, we import textiles, we import fabric, shirts, toys, things like that. And if you place a tariff on top of those, that is an increase in the costs of importing the good. So to avoid that, you might decide to make a good here, make a product here. And that was the goal of this tariff of 1816. Now, as we go through time, the southern states really begin to sort of reject the idea of this tariff completely. Now, Southerners in particular, and we're talking about places like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, later on Alabama, they export most of their cotton and tobacco products. And so they would go on to understand that over time, this tariff, which was meant to incentivize American manufacturing, really just increased the cost of everything that they bought. And it limited the foreign market for Southern goods because some people didn't want to buy American cotton or American tobacco because of the increased cost of bringing that back to America. So it really starts to set off the southern states and make them upset. So here we see this division between North, South, and West. The North is a really big manufacturing center, which is what the tariff of 1816 was meant to protect American manufacturing. But in the end, it really hurt southern states because they were buying imported goods as well, and it made things just more expensive for them. So you start to see this division between the North and the South. Now, one of the next things that really starts to show the regionalization of the United States is land policy, particularly in the West. So, we talked in the last section about buying out this new territory, the Louisiana Purchase, how we now have frontier land all the way past the Mississippi River. So, people start to want to move there and want to start to settle there. Now, there is a system in place of surveying the land, selling Western land, dividing it up into units so that people can buy it. And there's a lot of pressure to reduce the price of the land and ultimately reduce the size of what is the minimum unit. So instead of forcing people to buy huge, bigger and larger tracts of land, people wanted to buy smaller pieces of property. Um, Westerners, they want cheap land, but the northern manufacturers, they're worried that all of this cheap land will incentivize people to move there. And if people move out west, there's fewer and fewer workers in the north for the manufacturing. And that would drain the surplus of labor and ultimately drive wages up, which means they would have to pay people more and their products would be more expensive. Then you have southern planters, southern farmers who are much concerned that cheap western land would increase competition in cotton production, right? If you could move a little bit further out west, but still have an area of land that's conducive or able to grow cotton, right? That's more people growing cotton. So again, you see this division, this regionalization of the United States. There's Westerners who want cheaper land, people who want to move out west, the Northerners who are concerned, and then the Southerners who are also concerned about this availability of land. So land policy in the United States becomes really important as well. How do we handle this division of land? And it begins to create sectionalization and becomes an issue over time as well. So now this takes us to probably what we would consider to be the most divisive sectional issue, right, or regional issue, which is American slavery. So it's really important. We want to make sure that we address it here. And how does it influence the debates of the powers of the federal government, or how does it influence how the government functions? So that is what we're going to take a look at here. So, again, it's important to recognize that slavery is the most divisive regional issue in the United States in the early period of the Republic. This will ultimately lead on to the Civil War in the mid 1800s, 1860s. Now, here in this period, we're talking around 1806, 1808 to around 1820. So we're kind of still in that early Republic period. Now, we remember as well in the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s that there was a compromise made, the Three-Fifths Compromise, where three-fifths of a slave, an enslaved person, would count towards a state's population. So after those compromises are made, there was not that much conflict about slavery in national politics. It was very regional. Uh, the importation of enslaved Africans kind of rose in the 1790s. The United States kind of ended that and abolished that in 1808. And there really wasn't a lot of major concern. It didn't really affect national politics. But as the nation starts to expand, right, and we're talking now from around 1808 to around 1819, right, because there's really not a lot of huge national issue pre 1808. But after 1808, we start to see new states added to the Union. And one of the ways that the federal government, tries to deal with the issue of slavery so that there's not, because it does start to become a regional issue, is to add states in equal number, one free state for every slave state. So you have Ohio added, you have Indiana added, and Illinois added to the Union as free states. And over time, you also have Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama added as slave states. So they are added in pairs. So Ohio and Louisiana, then Indiana and Mississippi, and then Illinois and Alabama, just to keep the balance. By the time we get to 1819, there are 22 states in the United States. 11 of them are free and 11 of them are slave owning states. Now, the factor in the expansion of slavery, something we talked about, is the growth in the cotton industry, the cotton growing industry. And this is one of the reasons why the Southerners support it. Growing cotton is very labor intensive. So having this source of labor is something that's very important to them. So again, you start to see the regionalization. The Northerners don't necessarily see a need for the slavery because they have the labor, they have manufacturing, but the Southerners, they need it, or they feel like they need it because of this very labor intensive industry growing cotton. The Northerners, they're irritated by slavery. They don't want to have to really deal with this issue as we go on into the 1800s. But ultimately, they really consider it to be a local issue because overall, the federal government has tried to balance it out, right? Adding a free state for a slave state. So it's really considered a local issue until we get to 1819. So as we go through around 1818 to 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise. And this is how the attempt will be made to deal with the question of adding Missouri in as a state to the Union. Again, remember, we had 22 states at the time. We had 11 free states, 11 slave states. Now Missouri wants to come into the Union, and how do we handle their entrance? And you see here Henry Clay. Keep Henry Clay in mind, by the way. We're going to talk about him again as we get later towards the end of the section. But let's take a look at the Missouri Compromise. So, as we'd said, from the Constitutional Convention all the way up until around 1818, right? Once we decided how to compromise over the accounting of enslaved people in a state's population, slavery wasn't a huge national issue. It was very, very regional. But one of the first and most critical moments that forces slavery into national politics is the admission of Missouri as a slave state. Now, Missouri is right here above my finger. The Missouri Territory, by the time we get to 1818, had reached 60,000 settlers. And so that was sort of the threshold that you had to reach as a territory to get to statehood. And a lot of settlers there were slave owners, so slavery would be a thing in Missouri, and Missouri would become a slave state when it came into the Union. And that was a problem because there wasn't really a territory available to be a free state. And up until now, we had done one free state for one slave state. So, as the debate about allowing Missouri to become a state in the Union, right, that takes an act of Congress. So, it's being debated in Congress. There's a bill put forward to allow Missouri to come in as a state. And one of the congressmen, you see him here, Representative Talmadge of New York, introduced an amendment to that bill that would have banned for any further introduction of slavery and would have provided that any enslaved person that was born in Missouri would be free after they turned 25. Now, eventually, obviously, that would sort of phase out slavery in Missouri. Now, again, Northerners had become sort of irritated by the conversation over slavery. The federal government had tried to maintain balance by um, having one free state and one slave state enter the Union at the same time. But again, Northerners are starting to get a little bit irritated by this conversation over slavery. And there wasn't really a free state to enter the Union at the same time to maintain that balance. Now, the Southerners were very upset, right? Representative Talmadge, his amendment pretty easily passed the House, where the North had a bit more power. But in the Senate, the Southerners were very upset, and they saw this as the first attempt of Northerners to really start to get rid of slavery. So again, you start to see the sectionalism happening here. And this is the debate. This is the contention between the two regions. And this is how regionalization affects national politics. So, again, Representative Talmadge put forward this amendment. It really didn't go anywhere. But again, we're still sort of at a stalemate of what to do with the Missouri question. And that's where Henry Clay comes in. So after months of debate, right, going back and forth, arguing about the Missouri question, Henry Clay, who we will talk about again because he's a pretty important figure in this section and in this unit, and in this time period in general. Henry Clay is really involved in a lot of the things we've already talked about. But Henry Clay won support for three different laws, three different bills that he put forward that represented what would become known as the Missouri Compromise, right? How do we answer the question? How do we make as many people happy as possible, right? So the first was that Missouri would be allowed to enter the Union as a slave state. The second was that Maine would be kind of cut out of part of New England and allowed to enter as a free state, again, maintaining that balance, one free state for one slave state. So we would go from 22 states to 24, and everything would be even, 12 slave states, 12 free states. But then the third bill was kind of the compromise, right? So you can allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, but then there's no more slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Territory. So anything west of Missouri that comes in would not be allowed to have slavery. No new slavery for the rest of the Louisiana Territory north of the latitude 36 degrees, 30-minute line, which is that green line right above me. So he gets support. He comes, bridges the gap, brings in the Southerners, brings in the Northerners, and is able to get a consensus of everybody. And this is what becomes the Missouri Compromise. So after that, right, after everyone comes together and we pass these three laws, Missouri comes in, Maine is now a free state as well. These sectional feelings, these regional feelings about slavery kind of died down a bit, right? Everything's kind of smoothed over and calmed down. And because we maintained some sense of balance, we brought in a free state along with Missouri. So everything's kind of calm for at least the next 30 years. So you're looking here, 1820s when we have the Missouri Compromise. Everything's pretty chill till about 1850, right around the 1850 mark. And of course, that's when we start getting towards the Civil War. Civil War starts around 1860s. Um, but we maintain the balance, but it's really only temporary, right? So this debate over Missouri and the fact that how much slavery sort of interjected itself in national politics really shows you and symbolizes this sectionalism in the country. And you can look at it on the map that you see here. The blue states are the free states, the red states are the slave states. They're divided, right? And they will ultimately be divided again when we go to the Civil War in the 1860s. And we'll talk about that as we go. But there is this growing sense of sectionalism. And some of that still exists today, but it's definitely very prevalent in this new republic that we're trying to build here. So, as I said, we're going to talk again about Henry Clay. Henry Clay is a very important figure in this time period. And a lot of the things that we've talked about in this section are related to Henry Clay. And so now we're going to talk about the American system. It's more than just the Missouri Compromise for Henry Clay. Henry Clay is really trying to play a unifying role in the new republic, and you'll see how in just a bit. So going back a little bit, after the War of 1812, which again, we'll talk about the War of 1812 in lesson 4.4, Henry Clay proclaims his support. He asserts his support for something called the American system. And the American system is a legislative program, an economic program that's designed to unify the country by doing three things. First was setting the first protective tariff to encourage American manufacturing and to protect American manufacturing from foreign competition. We talked about that earlier in the section with the tariff of 1816. The second was creating a second national bank to expand financial support and credit to farmers. And again, you see here how we're trying to balance things. Encourage American manufacturing, that's really a northern concern, right? The North has a lot of manufacturing, the South doesn't. So, how do we balance that out? Henry Clay thinks, let's create another national bank to sort of stabilize the currency, stabilize the financial market, and then provide credit to farmers in the South. Um, the third was sort of the contentious part, and what was really debated a lot was establishing a national transportation system to facilitate trade between the states, that being roads, canals, you name it, um, but with federal spending, right? So the kind of easiest comparison to something that would have happened recently in modern history is when the Biden administration and the Congress passed the infrastructure spending bill, which was trillion plus dollars of spending on infrastructure, building roads, bridges, highways, etc. Right? That was more recent. And that's the same thing that Henry Clay wanted to do. He wanted the federal government to spend money to build infrastructure, roads, canals, so that trade between the states was easier. It would be easier for the South to trade with the North to send things back to the South. And then we're going to prop up and support American manufacturing. We're going to give credit to farmers so they can farm. It was a big idea from Henry Clay, but the contention in the third part, this national transportation system, and again, you can see how sectionalism comes to play, is who would benefit more, right? Are they going to benefit more? Are the Northerners going to benefit more? Are the Southerners going to get better?
it was the contention, and that's why ultimately that last part didn't happen. Only the first two happened. And we've already talked about the tariff of 1816 and how unfortunate that was for the American economy. So it didn't play out exactly how Henry Clay would have liked, but maybe if he had gotten that national transportation system, it would have been a little bit different. So let's wrap up lesson 4.3 by taking a look at the three different takeaways that are important to remember out of this section. So let's take a look at those. So the three things that you should take away from this lesson are that regional interests often trumped national concerns. Most people were worried about their region, their state, their community. And that's still pretty true today. But in this period in particular, most leaders' positions on things like slavery and economic policy were really based on where they were from, right? Southerners were very much more agricultural, agrarian. The Northerners very much worried about manufacturing and things like that. That's how we worried about things in that period. Secondly, congressional attempts at political compromise, such as the Missouri Compromise, really only temporarily stayed the tensions between the different regions and different opponents, especially with supporters of slavery, like with the Missouri Compromise. That happened in 1820. By 1850, sectionalism was back. We were debating slavery again. And then within 10 years of that, in the 1860s, we were fighting a war over it. And we'll talk more about that as we get there. Third, lastly, we just talked about this plans to unify the US economy with the American system generated a lot of debate over whether policies like that would have benefited agriculture or industry, and favoring different regions in the country. So, who benefits the most, right? That was the concern with something like the national transportation system and spending money to build highways, or not highways, obviously, at the time, but roads, canals, railroads, things like that. Who benefits the most? And as we go throughout, you'll see how the North really gets a lot of infrastructure spending, really gets a lot of railroads. So we'll take a look at that in more detail. That wraps up lesson 4.3. I'll see you for 4.4.